There are love stories that bloom quietly, that grow in the soft soil of ordinary life, unnoticed by the world. And then there are love stories that burn, that light up the sky like a flashbulb, brilliant and blinding, leaving an afterimage long after the moment has passed. The love story of Jean Harlow and William Powell was the second kind. It was a romance born inside the most glamorous and ruthless machine the modern world had ever built, Hollywood in its golden age. And it carried within it all the beauty, the ambition, the heartbreak, and the tragedy that only that particular world could produce. To understand what these two people meant to each other, you first have to understand what kind of world shaped them. Because neither Jean Harlow nor William Powell arrived in Hollywood as polished, finished things. They were made there, piece by piece, year by year, and the making of them was not always gentle. She was born Harleen Harlow Carpenter on March 3rd, 1911, in Kansas City, Missouri. The world would come to know her as Jean Harlow, platinum blonde, luminous, a figure so vivid she seemed almost invented. But the woman beneath that image was something far more complicated and far more tender than the studios ever wanted audiences to know. Her parents divorced when she was just 9 years old, and that early fracture would echo through every relationship she ever formed. Her father, Dr. Montclair Carpenter, was a dentist, a steady, respectable man, and when he disappeared from her daily life, he took something with him that she spent the rest of her short life trying to recover: a need for protection, a hunger for a guiding hand, a wish to be loved without condition, without performance, without the constant pressure to be spectacular. Her mother, also named Jean Harlow, a woman of fierce ambition and frustrated dreams, moved her daughter first to Chicago, and then, after a brief and unhappy detour, eventually to Los Angeles. Mama Jean, as she was known, had always imagined herself destined for something greater than ordinary life, and when her own shot at stardom faded, she simply redirected that energy onto her daughter. With almost alarming single-mindedness, she saw in young Harleen not just a child to raise, but a vehicle, a project, a second chance. The family's time in Chicago brought another complication into Harleen's life. Her mother's second husband, a man named Marino Bello, slick and charming on the surface, with the air of a man who believed himself to be more important than he was, Bello unsettled the teenage Harleen in ways she couldn't always articulate. His attentions toward her were uncomfortable. The household felt wrong. And so, at the age of 16, Harleen Carpenter did what many young women of her era did when the home felt too dangerous or too suffocating. She got married. Her first husband, Charles McGrew, was a wealthy young man from Chicago society. He offered her stability, comfort, and distance from her mother's orbit. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like an escape. But Mama Jean was not so easily outrun. When the couple relocated to Beverly Hills, ironically to put space between them and Jean's mother, Mama Jean simply followed. And she didn't just follow. She took charge. It was during the second stay in Hollywood that the accident of destiny occurred. Harleen was dared by a friend to go down to Central Casting, more as a lark than a serious ambition. The casting director saw her and couldn't look away. The call came the next day. When asked for her name, she gave the one that felt right: Jean Harlow. Her mother's name. The name of a woman who had always wanted to be a star. It was a gesture of love, and perhaps a surrender. William Horatio Powell was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1892, 19 years before the woman who would become the greatest love of his life drew her first breath. He came from a working-class family, and there was nothing in his upbringing that immediately announced theatrical greatness. He was a thoughtful young man, quietly restless, uncertain of his direction. What he discovered, almost by accident, was that the stage felt like home. He threw himself into the work with the seriousness of someone who understood that talent without discipline is merely potential. He trained in vaudeville, that lively and underappreciated school of American performance, where comedic timing, physical presence, and the ability to hold a crowd's attention were not optional skills, but survival requirements. From vaudeville, he moved into stock theater, where a working actor might perform in 8 or 10 different productions in a season, learning lines for multiple roles simultaneously, developing an extraordinary range and a meticulous professionalism. This was not glamorous work. It was grinding, demanding, educational in the deepest sense. By the time William Powell arrived in New York and began securing roles on Broadway, he had been trained by experience in a way that no classroom could replicate. His transition to film came at just the right moment. Or rather, the moment made itself right around him. A generous introduction from John Barrymore, one of the great theatrical presences of the era, helped open the door. Powell entered the silent film world and spent years there playing villains and shady characters, his fine-boned, intelligent face lending itself naturally to roles that required a certain cultivated menace. But it was the arrival of sound that transformed him. Many of his contemporaries in silent film stumbled badly when the microphones arrived, their voices tinny, their diction poor, their stage fright audible. Powell stepped into the sound era with the confidence of a man who had been training for it his entire career. His voice was warm, dry, and precise. His delivery was effortless. He made the transition look easy, which was the greatest illusion of all. Jean Harlow's early career was a series of small steps and lucky accidents. She appeared in Laurel and Hardy's short comedies at Hal Roach Studios, where she absorbed lessons in comic timing from two of the greatest physical comedians who ever lived. She was stunning to look at, but she was also paying attention, learning. Her hair, that extraordinary, nearly white blonde that defied easy description, became something nobody had planned. Standard bleaching processes reacted with her hair in unexpected ways, producing a shade that sat somewhere between silver and light that seemed almost otherworldly under studio lights. When Columbia borrowed her for a Frank Capra picture and decided to put her name in the title, the phrase platinum blonde entered the cultural vocabulary. It stuck to her forever. Howard Hughes saw her and made a gamble. He cast her as a lead in Hell's Angels, a sprawling, expensive aviation epic that he had personally financed and driven nearly to ruin through perfectionism and delay. Jean Harlow was not, at this point, a trained actress. Hughes himself acknowledged she was raw, but there was something she had that training couldn't manufacture, an electric, unguarded quality, a presence that the camera simply refused to ignore. The film premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood in 1930, and overnight, Jean Harlow became famous. She was 19 years old. MGM recognized what they were looking at and bought her contract from Hughes. The studio put her in films that push against the era's limits, pre-code pictures that traded in sexuality and moral ambiguity, where Jean Harlow's particular gift for combining innocence with frank sensuality found its fullest expression. Red-Headed Woman, Red Dust, Bombshell. These were films that understood something essential about her, that her appeal wasn't simply physical. She was funny. She was real. She made audiences feel like they were in on the joke. Meanwhile, William Powell had survived the wreckage of his early sound career. Paramount hadn't known what to do with him. Warner Brothers had poached him, and then dropped him when they couldn't figure out how to use him properly. He was approaching 40, and in Hollywood, 40 for a man who hadn't yet found his signature role was not a comfortable place to be. Irving Thalberg at MGM saw something others had missed. He signed Powell and cast him in a modest detective story adapted from a Dashiell Hammett novel. The Thin Man was shot in 3 weeks, treated by the studio as a minor production, and became one of the biggest surprise hits of 1934. William Powell as Nick Charles, urbane, witty, fond of a drink, deeply in love with his wife Nora, was a revelation. He had found the role that fit him perfectly, the character that allowed every quality he possessed to be seen clearly. Nick Charles was not just a detective. He was a man who was genuinely, happily married, and the novelty of that, a Hollywood picture celebrating rather than complicating a loving partnership, delighted audiences who were tired of the standard formula. William Powell was suddenly, finally, a star, a real one. They met, as so many Hollywood stories begin, on a film set. In late 1934, Jean Harlow visited the set of Manhattan Melodrama, where she had come to see Clark Gable. There was William Powell, working alongside Gable, and something shifted in the air between them. The attraction was immediate and, to those who knew them, made a certain obvious sense. He was 19 years older than she was. He was polished, self-contained, certain of himself in a way that she had never quite managed to be. She was luminous and warm and still, in some essential part of herself, the girl from Kansas City who had lost her father too young and never entirely recovered from the absence. She called him Poppy almost from the beginning, The nickname was not a secret. It was an admission. For his part, Powell was drawn to something in Jean Harlow that had nothing to do with her public image. Behind the platinum hair and the studio machinery and the manufactured persona, he could see someone genuinely funny, genuinely kind, and genuinely lost. She made him laugh. She made him feel needed. She was, in all the ways that mattered privately, the opposite of her public self. Not calculating or seductive by design, but spontaneous, warm, a little chaotic, and entirely real. They began spending time together, first quietly, then in ways that the studio noticed and decided to exploit. MGM put them together on screen in Reckless in 1935, a film built specifically around the fact of their real-life romance. They followed it with Libel Lady in 1936, which became one of the great screwball comedies of the era. On screen, their chemistry was unmistakable. The ease between them, the private jokes visible in their eyes, the sense that these two people genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Off-screen, the relationship was more complicated. Jean Harlow wanted to marry him. This was not ambiguous. She had decided, with a wholehearted certainty that characterized everything she did emotionally, that William Powell was the person she had always been searching for. She was willing to walk away from her career. She was willing to give up the fame, the films, the studio machinery that had built her. She told people plainly that being a movie star had never been her dream. Her dream was a home, a husband, children. Powell gave her a star sapphire ring. It was a beautiful thing, and she wore it constantly, and she called it, with a kind of heartbroken humor that told you everything about the situation, her unengagement ring. Because he would not call it an engagement. He would not commit to the word, to the formal declaration, to the thing she was asking for. He had been married before, to Carole Lombard, one of the great comic actresses of the era. That marriage had lasted 2 years before dissolving, partly because Powell had found it difficult to be the quieter presence beside a personality as large and brilliant as Lombard's. He understood something about himself. He did not want to be consumed. He did not want to marry a star.